Imagine stepping into the boots of a young soldier, strong, vibrant, and full of life, serving her country, only to have that life stolen in a brutal and senseless act. Darlene Krashoc was one of those soldiers. What happened to her is more than a murder. It's a question that haunts the very streets of Colorado Springs, a case that echoes through time unanswered. But tonight, we take you into her world, her story, and into the dark mystery that surrounds her untimely death. Darlene Krashoc was more than just a soldier. She was a 20-year-old woman full of promise, stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. Joining the army had been a bold step for Darlene, a way to serve her country while carving out a path for her future. She was known for her infectious smile, a fierce dedication to her duties, and the close bonds she built with her fellow soldiers. Stationed in the 73rd Maintenance Company, Darlene's role in the military was one of precision and responsibility. Her friends described her as someone who was always reliable, the kind of soldier who never missed a beat and made others feel at ease. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a friend, a daughter, a young woman with a whole future ahead of her. And yet, despite her bravery, despite the uniform she wore with pride, on one fateful night in March of 1987, all of that was taken away. What started as a typical evening out with friends turned into a nightmare. Her brutal murder would leave not just the military community in shock, but everyone who knew her. What could drive someone to take the life of such a promising young woman? And how did a night of fun and camaraderie spiral into one of the most perplexing cold cases in Colorado history? This is where her story begins, but the end is far from written. Because what happened to Darlene Krashoc isn't just about solving a crime, it's about justice for a soldier who deserved so much more. Tonight, we start peeling back the layers of a life cut tragically short and a case that still cries out for answers. March 17th, 1987, started off like any other night for Darlene and her friends. She was in good spirits, enjoying a much needed break from the rigors of military life. Darlene and a group of fellow soldiers decided to spend the evening at a local club, Shuffles, a popular spot in Colorado Springs where soldiers often went to unwind. The mood was light. Darlene, known for her easygoing nature, seemed relaxed as she danced and chatted with her friends. It was a typical night out for a group of soldiers, nothing that hinted at the darkness that was about to unfold. They moved between drinks and conversation, the atmosphere charged with the energy of young people enjoying life. But somewhere in the background of the night, the path that led to Darlene's tragic fate was beginning to take shape. By the time the clock ticked into the early hours of March 18th, Darlene's friends started to trickle out, one by one. People recall her leaving the club sometime after midnight, but there were no immediate red flags. She wasn't seen arguing with anyone, nor did she appear overly intoxicated. It was just another evening that should have ended with everyone returning to base safe and sound. But for Darlene, that wouldn't be the case. The last confirmed sighting of her was around 1 am, as she left Shuffles. She didn't leave alone, but eyewitness accounts remain blurry. Was she with someone she knew? Was this person a friend, a stranger, or someone she had just met? These were the first cracks in the timeline, the beginning of the mystery that would baffle investigators for years to come. After that moment, Darlene simply vanished. No one from her group could have predicted the horror that awaited, and as her friends returned to base, assuming Darlene would follow soon after, they couldn't have known that something had already gone terribly wrong. What was supposed to be a carefree night of fun was the last anyone would ever see of Darlene Krashoc alive. What happened next would leave the entire community searching for answers that, to this day, remain elusive. It was still dark when a routine patrol car drove through the parking lot of an old, nondescript restaurant located on the outskirts of Colorado Springs. The restaurant, Korean Club Restaurant, was closed at the time and the parking lot was empty, quiet. But what the officers stumbled upon next was anything but routine. Behind the restaurant, partially obscured by the shadow of a dumpster, lay the lifeless body of a young woman. It was clear from the moment the officers approached that this was no accident. The scene was disturbingly violent. Her body had been dumped as if it were nothing, left discarded in the cold morning air. The officers could tell immediately that she had been brutally beaten. The signs of strangulation were evident around her neck, and her clothing was torn, hinting at the unspeakable violence she had endured in the hours before her death. There were no identifying belongings around her, no wallet, no ID, nothing that could immediately tell them who she was. The officers were standing at the edge of a mystery, one that would soon envelop the entire city. As word spread through the local police department, a wave of disbelief hit the military base at Fort Carson. It wasn't long before investigators connected the dots. This was Darlene Krashoc, the young soldier who had gone missing after a night out with friends. For Darlene's fellow soldiers, the news hit like a punch to the gut. One moment she was out dancing and enjoying herself, and now she was gone, her body found in a place that should have been nothing more than a quiet, forgotten corner of the city. The shock and horror of the discovery rippled through the community, leaving a trail of confusion and grief in its wake. But it wasn't just the discovery of her body that haunted investigators, it was the brutality of the crime. Whoever had done this had made sure to leave a chilling message, not just through the act itself, but by the callous way in which her body was discarded, as if her life had meant nothing. This was the moment that turned Darlene Krashoc's murder from a tragic loss into a haunting mystery, one that would baffle law enforcement and leave her family and friends searching for justice for decades to come. The news of Darlene's murder spread quickly through both Colorado Springs and the military base. A young soldier, one of their own, had been killed in a manner so brutal that it seemed unfathomable. For her fellow soldiers at Fort Carson, the reality of losing someone they served alongside was devastating. The bonds formed in the military run deep, and for those who had shared daily routines, training exercises, and off duty hours with Darlene, the horror of her murder was impossible to comprehend. The sense of camaraderie was replaced by a wave of fear and confusion. How could something so violent happen to someone so close? The early days of the investigation were intense. Local police in Colorado Springs were the first to take charge, but it wasn't long before military investigators from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division (SID) joined the effort. The collaboration between the two agencies was immediate. After all, this wasn't just a civilian crime, it was the murder of an active duty soldier, and both the local authorities and the military knew they had to work together to solve it. The military community at Fort Carson was shaken to its core. Darlene's fellow soldiers couldn't help but wonder if one of their own could be responsible, or if an outsider had somehow infiltrated their tight-knit world. Speculation ran rampant, with everyone from soldiers to local civilians whispering theories about what had happened and why. For the military investigators, the focus was on finding answers as quickly as possible. But with few leads and no clear suspects, the investigation was off to a frustratingly slow start. The first steps involved interviewing everyone who had been with Darlene on that fateful night. Investigators retraced her steps, piecing together her movements from the club to the moment she vanished. Friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances were questioned. Was there someone she had met that night? Had she gone willingly with the person who would ultimately end her life? The cooperation between local police and the Army's SID was essential, but it wasn't without its challenges. Civilian law enforcement had experience handling violent crimes, but the military added a layer of complexity. Investigators had to consider whether this was an isolated crime or if something more sinister was at play, possibly a threat to other soldiers or the broader military community. As the investigation unfolded, the weight of Darlene's murder began to press down on everyone involved. For the military, this was a soldier who had sworn an oath to protect her country. To see her life ended in such a violent and senseless way felt like a deep betrayal of that oath. For local authorities, it was a race against time, knowing that whoever had killed Darlene could still be out there, free to strike again. In those early days, hope was high that answers would come quickly. But as leads began to dry up, the complexity of the case deepened, and the military community was left grappling with a painful reality. The killer was still at large, and justice for Darlene was nowhere in sight. The autopsy conducted on Darlene Krashoc's body revealed the full extent of the brutal attack she had endured. The findings were clear: Darlene had been sexually assaulted before her death, and the cause of death was strangulation. The bruising around her neck, the trauma to her body, it all painted a gruesome picture of the violence she had suffered in those final moments. The attack wasn't quick or merciful, it was prolonged and filled with a chilling level of cruelty. The fact that Darlene had been strangled was significant. Strangulation often indicates a deeply personal crime, one where the killer is physically close to the victim, exerting control over them, watching their life drain away. It suggested that whoever had killed Darlene wanted to dominate her, to exert power over her in the most intimate and terrifying way possible. This wasn't a random act of violence committed by a stranger in the night. It felt deliberate, with an intent that went far beyond just taking her life. The sexual assault only added to the grim nature of the crime. It pointed investigators toward the possibility that Darlene's murder had been driven by a violent sexual impulse, perhaps even premeditated. This kind of assault, followed by the methodical act of strangulation, led investigators to consider a range of theories about the killer's mindset. Was this someone with a history of sexual violence? Was this an opportunistic crime, or had the killer targeted Darlene specifically? In those early days, the autopsy findings became the foundation upon which the investigation rested. The combination of sexual assault and strangulation suggested to investigators that Darlene's killer wasn't just someone looking for a random victim. This was someone with deep-seated rage or deviant impulses. It raised the unsettling question of whether Darlene had known her killer. Was it someone she had encountered before that night, or someone who had followed her from the club with sinister intent? The physical evidence from the autopsy also gave investigators crucial leads in terms of forensic analysis. DNA evidence collected from Darlene's body would later play a pivotal role in the case, though at the time DNA technology was still in its early stages. Nonetheless, they knew that the biological evidence recovered would be key in identifying the person responsible for this vicious crime. The findings from the autopsy didn't just reveal the cause of death, they laid bare the psychological profile of a killer driven by control, violence, and a desire to inflict suffering. It was clear that this wasn't a simple case of a robbery gone wrong or a random encounter. Darlene's murder was intimate, violent, and calculated, and her killer was still out there, leaving the community on edge and investigators determined to bring justice to a soldier who had been robbed of her future in the most brutal way imaginable. When officers arrived at the parking lot behind the Korean Club restaurant, they were confronted with a disturbing scene. Darlene's body had been discarded as if her life meant nothing, but the evidence around her told a different story, one that investigators knew they had to unravel, piece by painstaking piece. The first thing that stood out was the positioning of her body. Darlene had been left in a way that suggested the killer hadn't been in a rush to flee the scene. Her body was partially clothed, with her clothing torn and disheveled, indicative of the violent assault she had endured. The way her body was laid out, almost deliberately, suggested to investigators that the killer had taken his time, either confident that he wouldn't be interrupted or methodical in his actions. This immediately led to speculation that the area was chosen deliberately. Perhaps it was isolated enough for the killer to feel safe, but close enough to civilization that it wasn't entirely hidden. Near Darlene's body, investigators found tire tracks, suggesting that a vehicle had been used to transport her to the location. This raised the question, was she murdered at the scene, or was she killed elsewhere and dumped here afterward? the tire impressions became one of the first pieces of physical evidence collected, although matching them to a vehicle would prove difficult without more specific information. Other items found near the scene added to the mystery. Small, personal effects cigarette butts, a piece of fabric were all bagged and tagged as potential clues. But in the chaos of a public parking lot, separating relevant evidence from everyday litter became a challenge. Could any of these seemingly insignificant items be linked to the killer, or were they just the remnants of the city's daily grind? Each piece was treated with care, knowing that even the smallest clue could eventually point to a suspect. What stood out most, however, was the lack of significant blood evidence at the scene. Despite the violence Darlene had endured, there were no large pools of blood around her body. This led investigators to theorize that the actual murder might have occurred elsewhere, perhaps in the killer's vehicle or another secluded location before her body was brought to the parking lot. This theory was further supported by the relatively undisturbed nature of the area. There were no signs of a struggle, no indications that Darlene had fought for her life in that specific spot. It all pointed to a calculated move by the killer to dump her body after the crime had been committed. As investigators sifted through the evidence, they began to form a theory. The killer had likely been watching Darlene, possibly even following her from the club. The tire tracks, the deliberate positioning of her body, the lack of blood at the scene, it all pointed to someone who had planned the murder, at least to some extent. This wasn't a spur of the moment act of violence. It was cold, deliberate, and carried out with terrifying precision. The crime scene itself, though sparse in immediate answers, raised critical questions. Where had the murder actually taken place? How had the killer been able to move Darlene's body without being seen? And most hauntingly, had the killer chosen this spot beforehand, or had it been a crime of opportunity? Despite the careful collection of evidence and the meticulous analysis of the scene, investigators were left with more questions than answers. The clues were their tire tracks, personal items, the positioning of the body, but the puzzle pieces weren't fitting together as easily as they had hoped. Still, with Darlene's autopsy and the forensic evidence collected from the scene, they had the beginnings of a case. All they needed was the right lead to crack it wide open. But in those early days, even as investigators combed through the scene for every possible clue, the darkness of uncertainty hung over the case. Someone had planned this, someone had followed through with chilling precision, and now that person was still out there. As investigators delved into Darlene's life, they began by looking at those closest to her. In cases like this, the first rule is to start with the inner circle friends, acquaintances, anyone who had crossed her path in the days leading up to her murder. The soldiers she spent time with that night were interviewed extensively. Those who had been with her at Shuffle's club were questioned, as were others stationed at Fort Carson who knew her well. Was this a crime of opportunity, or had someone been harboring dark intentions all along? One of the initial theories revolved around the possibility that her killer was someone from the military. Darlene's life was deeply intertwined with her fellow soldiers, and given the personal nature of the crime, investigators couldn't ignore the idea that her murderer might be someone from within the ranks. The military community is close-knit, and crimes like these tend to draw attention inward first. Did someone from Fort Carson have a hidden vendetta? Was there an unspoken conflict that had escalated into violence? Several soldiers who had been out with her that night fell under scrutiny, but each interview seemed to lead nowhere. Their stories checked out, no one appeared to have any clear motive. Frustratingly, no one had seen anything suspicious, no arguments or altercations that stood out. As more soldiers were interviewed and cleared, this avenue of investigation began to lose momentum. Another theory that gained early traction was that Darlene had encountered a stranger that night, perhaps someone who had been lurking at the club or watching her movements from the shadows. Could this have been the work of a predator, someone who had targeted Darlene as she left shuffles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Eyewitnesses recalled seeing Darlene leave the club in the early hours, but no one could confirm who, if anyone, she left with. It was maddeningly unclear had she gone willingly with someone she knew or had she been abducted by a stranger. One promising lead came when a witness reported seeing a vehicle near the restaurant where Darlene's body had been found. The description of the car, though vague, led investigators to focus on tracking down similar vehicles in the area. Was it possible that Darlene had been forced into a car after leaving the club? Could her killer have driven her to the isolated parking lot behind the Korean club restaurant to carry out the crime? For weeks, investigators chased down every vehicle that matched the description, hoping that one of them would hold the answers they desperately needed. But as each lead was pursued, it inevitably turned cold. The soldiers who had been out with Darlene that night were all cleared of suspicion. The vague description of the car led to dead ends. And as the days turned into weeks, the initial momentum of the investigation began to falter. Theories continued to swirl. Some speculated that Darlene's killer might have been a transient, someone passing through Colorado Springs who had taken advantage of an opportunity before slipping out of town unnoticed. Others believed that the brutality of the crime suggested a repeat offender, someone who had committed similar acts of violence before and would likely strike again. The early suspects, once so promising, faded into the background, leaving investigators grasping at straws. Despite the extensive questioning and promising theories, each lead eventually fell apart, leaving Darlene's murder unsolved and the community on edge. The frustration of not finding a clear suspect was palpable. Her killer had seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but heartache and confusion. And so the case grew colder with each passing day. Investigators were left wondering, had they overlooked something? Was there a crucial detail hidden in plain sight waiting to be discovered? Or was Darlene's killer truly as elusive as he seemed, lurking somewhere in the city, knowing that he had gotten away with murder? This was the harsh reality of the investigation. Despite all efforts, the person who had brutally taken Darlene's life remained a ghost, impossible to pin down, and leaving the military community and Colorado Springs in a state of uneasy limbo. At the time of Darlene Krashoc's murder, DNA technology was still in its early stages. In fact, it wasn't yet widely used in criminal investigations. The concept of using genetic material to identify suspects had only just begun to break into the world of forensics. But the investigators on Darlene's case knew that the evidence collected from her body, particularly the biological samples, held immense potential. They just didn't have the tools to fully unlock it at that moment. Still, the crime scene investigators meticulously preserved all the physical evidence they could, knowing that advancements in technology might one day offer answers. Seminal fluid found on Darlene's body was carefully collected, as was trace evidence from her clothing. At the time, the best that could be done was blood typing, which offered a narrow profile but fell far short of providing definitive identification of the killer. For years, the DNA evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology to catch up to the ambition of the investigators. The case grew colder as leads dried up, and many feared that justice for Darlene would never come. But then, in the early 2000s, everything changed. By this time, DNA testing had advanced exponentially. The criminal justice system had fully embraced forensic science, and cold cases around the country were being reopened in the hopes that DNA could finally provide the answers that had eluded investigators for decades. Darlene's case was no different. In 2004, the Colorado Springs Police Department, along with military investigators, decided it was time to re examine the evidence in Darlene's case. The biological samples that had been collected in 1987 were sent to a lab, and for the first time, they were able to generate a full DNA profile of the killer. This was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. The DNA didn't just offer clues, it had the potential to directly identify the person responsible for Darlene's murder. But even with this new profile, the challenge wasn't over. In those days, DNA databases were still being built, and while investigators now had a clear genetic fingerprint of the killer, there wasn't an immediate match in the national system. The DNA profile was run through every available database, but the killer wasn't there. He had left his mark on Darlene's body, but he hadn't left any trace of himself in the system. It was another frustrating setback. Despite having what felt like the golden key to the case, investigators were still staring at an empty door. Still, the DNA provided something that hadn't existed before: hope. Investigators knew that as DNA databases grew, the chances of finding a match would increase. They were no longer chasing shadows, they had something tangible, something that could eventually lead them to the killer. It was a waiting game, but they knew that time and technology were finally on their side. In the years that followed, DNA technology continued to advance and the possibilities expanded even further. Genetic genealogy, the practice of using familial DNA to track down suspects through their relatives, began to revolutionize cold cases across the country. This breakthrough in forensic science would become the game changer for Darlene's case, but at the time, it was still on the horizon. For Darlene Krashoc, DNA had become her silent witness. It was the evidence that could not be swayed or silenced, and while it hadn't yet led to her killer, it held the promise that one day her story would be told in full. The technology to interpret that story was advancing rapidly, and investigators knew that they were closer than ever before to finding the answers they had sought for so long. The DNA would become the lifeline of the case, keeping it alive even when all other leads had gone cold. And though it would take years to finally crack open the mystery, the truth was now within reach, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Despite the early momentum in Darlene's case, where it felt like answers might be just around the corner, the investigation hit a brick wall. Every lead dried up. The early suspects had been ruled out, and even the crucial DNA evidence, which had once sparked hope, led nowhere at the time. There was no match in the databases, no name to attach to the killer. What had once seemed like a solvable crime began to fade into a painful uncertainty. Investigators found themselves grasping at straws, going over the same evidence again and again, hoping to spot something they might have missed. For Darlene's family, the toll was immeasurable. The loss of a daughter, a sister, a friend was compounded by the fact that they had no closure. Darlene had been taken from them in the most brutal way, and yet they had no justice. Every birthday, every holiday, every year that passed was a stark reminder of the life she never got to live. Her family watched as other cases were solved, other families got the closure they so desperately longed for, while they remained trapped in the nightmare of not knowing. Her mother, heartbroken, had once believed that her daughter's killer would be caught swiftly. But as the years went by, hope dwindled. The open wound of loss became a chronic pain, a heavy weight that her family carried with them everywhere. Darlene's father, a man of quiet strength, found himself in the frustrating position of having to protect his family's spirit while grappling with the reality that their daughter's murderer was still out there, somewhere, free. For Darlene's friends and fellow soldiers, the unresolved nature of her death hung over them like a cloud. The military community is one built on loyalty and trust, and to know that one of their own had been violently killed without justice was a stain on that bond. Many who had served alongside Darlene left Fort Carson with the painful knowledge that her killer had walked away unscathed. For some, it became an unresolved chapter of their own lives, a haunting memory they couldn't shake. The investigators who had worked so hard in the early stages of the case shared in this frustration. These weren't just professionals, many of them had become personally invested in finding Darlene's killer. Cold cases, especially ones this violent, have a way of sticking with the people who work on them. Detectives revisited the evidence countless times, but with no new leads, the case eventually stalled. The burden of not being able to give Darlene's family the answers they deserved weighed heavily on them. And so the case went cold. Files were tucked away, gathering dust, while Darlene's family, friends, and the community tried to move forward, though they never truly could. The years of silence were agonizing. Investigators, while busy with new cases, never fully let go of Darlene's murder, hoping that someday, somehow, a break would come. But as the case languished, the emotional toll became a constant presence. Cold cases are not just unsolved puzzles, they are emotional wounds that fester in the lives of everyone connected to the victim. For Darlene's loved ones, there was no forgetting, no moving on. Every day without an answer was another day spent in a limbo of pain and confusion. They lived with the knowledge that Darlene's killer was out there free, while they were trapped in a cycle of grief. Despite the years of silence, there was one thing that never wavered: the commitment of those who cared about Darlene to see justice done. They kept her memory alive, refusing to let her be forgotten. Though the case was cold, their desire for justice burned as hot as ever. They would not let the world forget Darlene Krashoc, even as the years ticked by without a single answer. But in the quiet of those years, something else was happening, something that no one could have predicted. While the world moved on, science was evolving. DNA technology was advancing in ways that would soon transform how cold cases were handled. And though Darlene's case had gone cold, the evidence preserved from her murder would soon be brought back into the light, offering a glimmer of hope that the silence might finally be broken. The murder of Darlene Krashoc sent shockwaves through the military community, particularly among the soldiers stationed at Fort Carson. It wasn't just that Darlene had been murdered, it was how brutally her life had been taken and how the killer seemed to slip away unnoticed. For many soldiers, this crime hit home in a way that other violent acts didn't. Darlene wasn't just a victim, she was one of them. She was a soldier, someone who had sworn the same oath as her comrades, and yet her killer had faced no consequences. Female soldiers, in particular, felt the weight of her murder in a deeply personal way. In the male dominated world of the military, they were already familiar with the unique challenges of serving in uniform, but Darlene's death added an element of fear that hadn't existed before. It was a reminder that even in the close knit bonds of military life, danger could still strike, and it didn't always come from the battlefield. Conversations among female soldiers shifted, becoming laced with an undercurrent of anxiety. Many began to question their own safety, wondering if someone they trusted could be capable of such violence. Darlene's murder was a reminder that, despite the strength of the military community, the real world filled with danger, cruelty, and uncertainty was never far away. Trust was broken, and that fracture lingered long after the investigation went cold. Fort Carson, like any military base, was a place where soldiers were supposed to feel secure. But after Darlene's death, that sense of security was shattered. The fact that her killer remained at large only deepened the wound. For many soldiers, her murder felt like a betrayal, not just of Darlene's life, but of the very values they held dear. Her fellow soldiers wanted justice for her, but as the years passed with no resolution, frustration and sadness began to replace hope. Darlene's case became a haunting presence, a reminder of the vulnerabilities they all shared. The memory of her murder left a lasting mark not just on her comrades, but on the entire military community at Fort Carson. It was a wound that would remain open for years until technology and determination would bring renewed hope. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had transformed the landscape of criminal investigations. What once seemed impossible, solving cold cases with only the smallest bits of biological evidence, had become the new frontier for law enforcement. For Darlene's case, which had grown cold for over a decade, these advancements sparked renewed hope. In 2004, investigators decided to re examine the evidence collected from the scene of Darlene's murder. It had been nearly 20 years since that fateful night in 1987, but the forensic samples, particularly the DNA from the sexual assault, had been carefully preserved. It was a decision that came at a time when DNA technology had advanced far beyond the rudimentary methods used during the original investigation. The key to this decision was the introduction of more sophisticated DNA testing methods. What had once been little more than a genetic fingerprint had now evolved into full DNA profiling, with the potential to link the suspect to family members through broader databases. This new era of forensic science provided fresh hope to the investigators who had never let Darlene's case truly go cold in their hearts. The decision to retest the evidence wasn't just a shot in the dark, it was a calculated move that could finally bring answers. Investigators knew that if they could get a match, they would finally have something concrete to go on. The passage of time, though painful for Darlene's family, had given the case a new lifeline, and with the advancements in forensic science, the possibilities for solving her murder were greater than ever before. The DNA profile, once again, was run through state and national databases, but just like before, no direct match was found. However, the hope hadn't been lost. This time, the technology was on their side, and investigators knew they were inching closer to justice. It was only a matter of time before the right lead surfaced. In 2016, a remarkable development reignited the case. Advances in forensic genealogy, the same methods used to crack notorious cold cases like the Golden State Killer, had opened up new possibilities. Investigators were now able to use familial DNA to trace the genetic profile of the suspect. It wasn't just about matching the DNA to a person, it was about finding a family tree and working backward. By tracing the DNA sample left on Darlene's body, investigators discovered a lineage, a family connected to the DNA profile. This meant that while they didn't yet know the name of the killer, they had a list of possible relatives. This was the break investigators had been waiting for. Using genealogy techniques, detectives painstakingly combed through records, building a family tree that could lead them to the killer. It was meticulous work tracking down relatives, cross-referencing their histories, and eliminating those who couldn't have been involved. Each branch of the family tree brought them closer to the person whose DNA had been left behind on that fateful night in 1987. Finally, after decades of silence, the pieces started to fall into place. A name emerged from the list of potential suspects, someone whose life had intersected with Colorado Springs in the late 1980s. This wasn't just a wild guess. This was science leading investigators directly to the man who had eluded them for so many years. It had taken nearly 3 decades, but now, for the first time, the killer's identity was within reach. The past had finally caught up, and the breakthrough in forensic genealogy was about to bring justice to Darlene Krashoc and her family. The DNA that had once been a silent witness had now become the key to solving the mystery, and the long wait for justice was nearing its end. Forensic genealogy wasn't just another investigative method, it was a revolution in how cold cases could be solved. Unlike traditional DNA matching, which relied on finding a direct hit in criminal databases, forensic genealogy allowed investigators to trace the DNA sample left at the crime scene to relatives of the killer. It was the equivalent of finding the right tree and then climbing branch by branch until they reached the person responsible. In Darlene Krashoc's case, the DNA sample collected from her body was run through a genetic database used for genealogy research. This database wasn't limited to criminal records, it included the DNA of ordinary people who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn more about their ancestry. By cross referencing the DNA from the crime scene with this database, investigators found distant relatives of the suspect. It wasn't a direct hit, but it was the first step in what would become a breakthrough hunt for the killer. From there, investigators worked backward, building a family tree based on the shared DNA markers. It was a slow, methodical process. Each relative they identified had to be investigated, their whereabouts in 1987 confirmed, and their potential involvement in the crime either ruled out or explored further. But with each step, they got closer to the person whose DNA had been left behind all those years ago. The use of forensic genealogy completely shifted the trajectory of the investigation. For decades, detectives had been chasing leads that went cold, suspects who never panned out, and theories that led nowhere. But now, for the first time, they had a genetic trail leading them directly to the killer's family and eventually to the man himself. This modern tool turned what had seemed like an unsolvable mystery into a case with a clear path forward. It was as if the investigation had been given a second life, one driven by science, precision, and the relentless determination to finally bring Darlene's killer to justice. In 2019, after years of painstaking genealogical research, investigators zeroed in on Michael White, a retired Army veteran living in Thornton, Colorado. His name had never come up in the original investigation. He wasn't on anyone's radar, just another face in the crowd. But his DNA, passed down through generations, had led investigators straight to him. Once White's name surfaced as a potential suspect, detectives quietly began to investigate him. They looked into his past, his movements, and most importantly, his connection to Colorado Springs in the late 1980s. The pieces started to fit. Michael White had been stationed at Fort Carson around the time of Darlene Krashoc's murder. It was the first major link between him and Darlene. But even with this connection, investigators needed something more concrete, something that would irrefutably tie him to the crime. That's when they decided to get White's DNA. Without alerting him, undercover detectives followed White and waited for the perfect opportunity. When he discarded a cup after a meal, investigators swooped in and collected it, securing a fresh DNA sample. The moment they had White's DNA, it was run against the profile from the crime scene, and there it was, the match they had been waiting for all these years. The DNA evidence collected from Darlene Krashoc's body in 1987 was an exact match to Michael White. It was the proof that finally brought the decades-old mystery to an end. In June 2019, authorities arrested Michael White at his home. The news shocked his family, his friends, and the public. White, who had lived a seemingly quiet and unremarkable life, was now the man accused of one of the most brutal murders in Colorado Springs history. The DNA evidence had spoken. It was Michael White who had taken Darlene's life all those years ago. Born in the early 1950s, Michael White had served in the U.S. Army, rising through the ranks to build a respectable military career. By the time of Darlene Krashoc's murder in 1987, White had been stationed at Fort Carson, the same base where Darlene served. It wasn't immediately clear whether they had ever crossed paths directly, but the proximity alone put him in the realm of suspicion once his DNA matched the crime scene. After leaving the military, White had lived a relatively quiet life in Colorado, never drawing attention to himself. He settled down, started a family, and blended into suburban life. For decades, he remained a ghost, someone who had committed a heinous crime, yet somehow managed to live undetected for over 30 years. But when investigators began to dig deeper into White's past, they found a man whose public persona didn't align with the violent act he had carried out. There was no immediate evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior, no trail of violence that pointed to him as a predator. To most who knew him, White seemed like an ordinary man, a retired veteran who had built a stable life. Yet the question of motive remained a haunting one. Why had White killed Darlene Krashoc? Was this a crime of opportunity, a moment where violent impulses overtook him? Or was there something deeper, something hidden in his past that hadn't yet come to light? Investigators were left to wonder whether this was a one time act of brutal violence or if there were other crimes in White's history that had gone unnoticed. While his background revealed no immediate signs of a violent past, the truth was undeniable. On that night in March 1987, Michael White had strangled and sexually assaulted Darlene Krashoc, then dumped her body like it was nothing. The quiet, unassuming life he had built afterward couldn't erase the horror of that night, nor the decades of pain it had caused. For Darlene's family and the investigators who had chased her killer for so long, the arrest of Michael White was a relief. But it also brought with it a sense of disbelief. How could someone live a normal life knowing they had committed such a terrible crime? The answers to those questions might never be fully known, but what was clear was this: Michael White, a man who had spent over 30 years hiding in plain sight, would finally face the consequences of his actions. The trial of Michael White began in 2019, more than 3 decades after Darlene's murder. The prosecution built its case primarily on the DNA evidence that had linked White directly to the crime. This was not just circumstantial evidence. This was the killer's genetic fingerprint, and it was found on Darlene's body. From the moment that match was made, the prosecution had a strong case in hand. Key testimonies came from forensic experts who explained the process of extracting and analyzing the DNA. They meticulously walked the jury through how White's DNA was identified using genealogy techniques, how it matched the DNA found on Darlene, and how these findings left no room for doubt. The prosecution also presented evidence of White's whereabouts in 1987. His time at Fort Carson, just miles from the crime scene, tied him to the setting of the murder. One of the biggest challenges the prosecution faced was the passage of time. Memories had faded, and many of the original investigators and witnesses were no longer available to testify. Additionally, without direct eyewitnesses to the crime itself, the prosecution relied heavily on the DNA and forensic evidence, knowing they had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that White had committed the crime. While the case seemed strong, the defense would try to poke holes in the narrative. Throughout the trial, the courtroom was filled with Darlene's family and friends, many of whom had waited for this moment for decades. For them, this trial was not just about convicting a man, it was about finally hearing Darlene's story told in full and holding her killer accountable for robbing them of a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Michael White's defense team focused on two primary arguments: the reliability of the DNA evidence and the circumstantial nature of the case. First, they questioned how the DNA was handled over the decades, suggesting that contamination or improper storage could have compromised the evidence. They argued that, given the long gap between the murder and the trial, it was possible that mistakes had been made in the forensic process. The defense also raised doubts about whether White's DNA conclusively proved that he was the killer. They suggested alternative explanations for why his DNA might have been found on Darlene's body, hinting at consensual contact or some other unknown interaction between the two. They argued that without direct evidence placing White at the scene of the murder, the prosecution's case was built on assumptions. Another key point of the defense was the lack of a clear motive. White, they argued, had lived a quiet, uneventful life since the murder, with no signs of violent behavior or criminal history. This absence of a clear motive, coupled with the decades-long gap, made the case feel speculative, they claimed. White's defense hoped to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury, aiming to weaken the strength of the prosecution's DNA-driven argument. While the defense worked hard to introduce doubt, the prosecution's case remained solid. The DNA was undeniable, and the circumstantial evidence linking White to the crime, though indirect, painted a compelling picture. On November 8, 2019, after hours of deliberation, the jury found Michael White guilty of the murder of Darlene Krashoc. The DNA evidence, combined with White's proximity to the crime and the expert testimonies presented by the prosecution, had convinced the jury that he was responsible for her death. White was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Darlene's family and friends, the verdict marked the end of a long, painful journey. After more than 30 years of waiting, they finally had the justice they had hoped for. The moment was bittersweet. While White's conviction brought a sense of closure, it couldn't erase the decades of grief or bring Darlene back. But knowing that her killer had been held accountable gave her family a small measure of peace. For the investigators who had worked the case, many of whom had long since retired, the verdict was a validation of their years of hard work and determination. It was proof that no matter how cold a case becomes, justice is always possible with perseverance and the right tools. The conviction of Michael White closed one of Colorado Springs' most haunting unsolved cases. Despite the conviction of Michael White, there were still unresolved aspects of the case that continued to haunt investigators and Darlene's family. Chief among them was the question of why. Why had Michael White, a man with no apparent history of violence, committed such a brutal crime? Was this a one-time act of violence, or was there something darker lurking in his past that had never been uncovered? There were also questions about the nature of White's connection to Darlene. Did they know each other? Was the attack premeditated, or was it a crime of opportunity? And how had White managed to evade detection for so long, living an apparently normal life for over 30 years while carrying the weight of this terrible crime? Investigators also wondered if White could be linked to other unsolved cases. Though there was no immediate evidence connecting him to other crimes, the brutal nature of Darlene's murder left lingering doubts about whether this was his first and only violent act. These lingering questions, though unlikely to ever be fully answered, remain a part of Darlene Krashoc's story. The trial may have brought justice, but it couldn't explain the inexplicable. It left behind mysteries that will forever be part of the case's legacy. The conviction of Michael White wasn't just a victory for Darlene's family, it was a watershed moment for forensic investigation. Her case highlighted the critical role that DNA technology now plays in criminal investigations. What had once seemed like an unsolvable mystery became a solved case because of advances in science and the determination of investigators who refused to give up. Darlene's case became a symbol of hope for other cold cases. It showed that even when years pass, when evidence seems to fade, there's always a chance that technology will catch up to the truth. Forensic genealogy, in particular, has revolutionized the way cold cases are approached, and Darlene's case stands as a shining example of its potential to bring justice to victims long forgotten. The legacy of Darlene Krashoc is also one of resilience. Her family, friends, and the investigators who worked on her case never stopped fighting for her, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. They are a testament to the power of persistence and to the idea that no case is ever truly cold as long as someone is still looking for answers. In the end, Darlene Krashoc's case not only brought justice for her, it opened new doors for solving other cold cases, giving hope to countless families still waiting for the truth. Her story reminds us all that time, though often cruel, can also be the path to justice.